What's up, everybody? Thank you for sticking around. Appreciate you guys being here. A couple of things. I'm dealing with a bit of a cough and a little bit of a sore throat. So apologies if you hear me hacking up a lung and taking sips of water throughout the presentation. So I love data. I absolutely love data. I love looking at data. I love exploring data. I love working with data. It's just the most fascinating thing for me. And so this, the kind of genesis of this talk was I just went through some of the cool conferences that I attended last year and just looked at some really interesting and unique data sets that I came across and put it together into this talk called Dataset Safari. These aren't necessarily like the most groundbreaking, cutting edge, uh, you know, largest data sets out there. I just think they're really, really fascinating and interesting data sets. And kind of have a filter in place for what I think makes a cool data set. And I'm going to discuss that in this talk as well. But it's a little bit about me, Harpreet Sahota. I'm hacker in residence here at Voxel 51. Background in math and stats. I've been doing machine learning for over 10 years and deep learning for the last 3-4 years. And recently just have, I guess, come to the realization, well, not recently, but over the last few years, come to the realization that data is super important. It's also beautiful. It's also interesting. So in this talk, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about some data sets that I think are cool. And then after all the talking, we're just going to get hands-on with the data. I'll show you what's inside those data sets. So you might want to whip out your phones because I'm going to be sending you some QR codes right now. First QR code is to the repo where you can access the code for reproducing everything that I've done in this presentation. So go ahead and check that out. And I'll be sure to drop a link as well. But it's under my repo, Harpreet Sahota 204. And if you look for Dataset Safari, it's right in there. I also post regularly on Medium. So each one of these data sets that I've covered, I've written an in-depth blog about these. So you can kind of go through those if you find anything that I talk about of interest to you. I'm sure you'll be interested in diving a little bit deeper. Vast majority, I think all of the data sets actually that we're going to talk about today are actually available to you on our Hugging Face org. So I'm sure Jimmy will drop a link to that for you. You'll be able to download all the data sets strictly from Hugging Face Hub and kind of start working with them right from the get-go. So as I mentioned, I love data. And as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, that I just want to talk to you about this kind of filter I have in place for how I assess data sets. And I call this the PRISM framework, PRISM. And it's really a way that I kind of look at data from 5 dimensions. One is I'm kind of looking at the patterns this data captures, any kind of interesting revelations that it brings to light about a particular domain or about some aspect of expert judgment or domain expertise. I'm also really interested in like the innovation in the data collection and data curation methods, and really kind of the whole, if you will say, the data engine that went into bringing this data set into existence. I'm also interested in understanding how domain expertise is encoded, like how is it systematically encoded in the collection process of this data set. And then also modalities. I'm interested in the different modalities that this data set captures. I think we shouldn't think of modality as just image and text and video and audio. There's other modalities out there. 3D is a modality. Barcodes are a modality. Geographic information is a modality. DNA sequencing is a modality. So there's more modalities outside of just human readable text and human perceptible images. And this kind of lens, this prism, if you will, helps us kind of understand what's in the data set, how it was built, what it teaches us, and how all these different aspects that are captured kind of work together to help us train a model. So what I want to do now is take this framework, this PRISM framework, if you will, and apply it to some data sets. The first data set I'm going to talk about is called ImageNet-D. So ImageNet-D is a synthetic test set that was created using diffusion models. So this data set itself has about 4,800 images with 113 object categories. And the categories form a natural kind of long tail distribution with the frequencies in the categories. And the images were generated by varying backgrounds for about 3,700 images, textures for about 500 images, and materials. And all of these images were generated using Stable Diffusion 2.1. And so kind of breaking down from the PRISM's perspective, the patterns that this data set captures is it's trying to capture the systematic failures in visual perception across different types of variations, specifically those variations being backgrounds, textures, and materials. And what we're trying to see is, or demonstrate, that model accuracy degrades when it's consistently degrades, actually, when these objects are placed in unusual context. And what this demonstrates is that foundation models, while they are robust, they still show consistent failure patterns. And what this reveals is that traditional data augmentation methods that work for other data sets fail to improve robustness on this particular data set. It also reveals that pre-training on larger data sets improves robustness actually more than architectural changes. Also, it reveals to us that vision language models struggle with nearest neighbor retrieval when the objects appear in unusual contexts. In terms of the innovation in the way it was collected, they used diffusion models rather than manually collecting or doing simple kind of image manipulations. And they do this really interesting hard mining of examples using multiple surrogate models. And they take the hardest samples, essentially, from what they've generated, and they have this kind of multi-stage quality control with both expert and crowd workers. And so this helps introduce kind of a transferable failure as some type of criteria for data set curation. In terms of systematic domain expertise, so they're encoding object recognition through careful prompt engineering. We're incorporating expert knowledge by selecting backgrounds, textures, and materials, and then systematically kind of categorizing these visual variations, the background, texture, and the material. And we're able to then leverage expertise in both computer vision and human perception for validation of the resulting data set. Modalities that we're working with here, we're combining text prompts with visual generation. And then we're having humans in the loop because they're providing visual verification of that machine-generated content. And so we're able to then merge the synthetic image generation with some natural image understanding. If you want to get more deep into this data set, remember, we're going to look at hands-on all the data sets in a few minutes, but you can read more in the paper here. Go ahead and scan that. Of course, I've written a blog on this as well, and I link out to that paper in the blog. The next data set I want to talk about is WebUOT1M. This is a 1.1 million frame data set across 1,500 video clips. There's 408 categories that are organized into 12 superclasses. And these videos are quite long in the sense that there's an average length of 733 frames, and the total duration of the entire data set is about 10.5 hours. So in terms of the patterns it's capturing is, first of all, this is the biggest, largest scale underwater object tracking data set. Most object tracking data sets are open air. This is the first one that's underwater. And so now we're able to capture really diverse underwater object behavior and movements, and we're able to see the different patterns of how objects appear in different water conditions. And those conditions are like visibility and color variation. We're also able to pick up patterns of occlusion and distraction that are unique to underwater environments. And with this, the authors are able to kind of document some common challenges in underwater tracking. For example, blur, similar distractors, and camouflages. In terms of revelations, it exposes that there's a big gap between open air and underwater tracking performance. So traditional tracking methods really tend to degrade in underwater conditions. We also see a long tail distribution of underwater objects in real scenarios. In terms of how the data set was collected and the innovation in that data collection and curation pipeline, they used online video platforms for large-scale data gathering, YouTube and Bilibili. They used a semi-supervised method to assist annotation for unclear frames. And then there's a multi-round verification process for quality control. And in terms of the types of videos that are captured, they're coming from online sources. So we have a mix of professional footage and amateur footage. In addition to that, we have multiple camera types as well. There's everything from professional underwater cameras, fisheye lens cameras, videos from mobile cameras and things like that. The way they're able to systematically encode domain expertise is that the annotators had a standardized protocol for labeling so that there was consistency in how objects were labeled. There's a two-stage collection process. We have the YouTube crawling plus manual underwater video collection. There's an initial filtering for quality, length, and relevance of content. And then the annotation process went in 3 rounds. There's object detection and bounding boxes. There's language descriptions of each scene, short little language description. And then the tracking attributes and fine-grained labels happened in a dense manner, so 1 frame per second for some continuous tracking. And then there's quality control through cross-validation between the annotators. And there's also a really good amount of coverage for diverse scenarios. In terms of modalities, this captured visual data, so video frames with linguistic descriptions. It uses enhanced frames to complement original underwater frames, and it's also integrating bounding box annotations with language prompts. So we're able to link some temporal information, the video sequence, with language and spatial annotations. You can go ahead and read more about WebUOT by following this QR code. And of course, I've written a blog about this as well. The next data set I want to talk about here is called Bioscan 5M. So this is this is a data set of 5.15 million specimens. 98% are insects, 2% are arthropods. We also have DNA barcodes for the specimens and geolocation information for the specimens. In terms of the patterns that it captures, we're capturing taxonomic hierarchies from phylum down to species. We're capturing geographic distribution patterns across 47 countries. And we're also capturing an abundance of taxonomic group information as well. We also see patterns in DNA barcode sequence that will help us identify similarity within these kind of taxonomic groups. In terms of what it reveals to us, we're able to uncover the kind of extent of undescribed species. So there's a lot of placeholder species names that kind of indicate new discoveries. We're able to reveal genetic diversity within the taxonomic groups through the DNA barcode analysis. We're able to show geographic distribution in the biodiversity sampling. We're able to highlight the challenges of species identification, and then also demonstrate the power of combining visual and genetic data. In terms of the innovations in data collection, so there's a standardized multimodal data collection that combines images, DNA, and a bunch of metadata. They develop a novel image cropping kind of method using a detection transformer. They're creating a really robust data cleaning pipeline for taxonomic labels. They implement some really innovative data partitioning for both closed world and open world scenarios. And in the paper, they discuss some new methods for handling incomplete taxonomic labels. And the way we're able to encode systematically encode expertise, domain expertise, is through this encoding of taxonomic information. And we're using expert knowledge in the DNA barcode analysis. We're also systematically applying photography protocols for each one of the specimens. And we're able to then formalize with this data set an identification process that uses both kind of morphological and genetic information. In terms of modalities, this was interesting because we have visual data with the microscope images, genetic data with the DNA barcode, but then geographic metadata with more detailed specimen data. So we're then able to link taxonomic classification with images, DNA, and geographic information. You can read more about BioScan 5M by following this QR code. It should take you to the paper. And this also is a blog that I wrote. And we've actually done, in a previous virtual session, actually, we had the author of this paper present. So you'd find that on our YouTube as well. This next data set is the illusory VQA data set, the illusion animals subset in particular. So illusion animals has 11 classes, so 10 animals plus a no illusion class. Each image is 512 by 512 pixels. The illusions are generated using a control net with a LLM generated prompt. We have both a real concept and an illusory concept in each image. The a data set underwent some NSFW filtering to remove any, potentially offensive content. And then there's also human validation that was performed on 10% of the samples. So the patterns we're able to capture, we're able to capture patterns of visual illusions where an image contains both real and illusory concepts. So we're able to document systematically the ways that humans misperceive or reinterpret visual information. And we show how different patterns in how different types of objects, for example, numbers, clothing, animal text, can be encoded as illusions. And what we see here is actually that there's, consistent degradation in VLM performance when these models are presented with a illusory image. So what this reveals to us is a significant gap between human and AI perception of illusions. And it shows us that current VLMs struggle when detecting and interpreting illusory concepts. And we see that actually, as I'll show when I pull up the data set, they use a really simple filtering technique to kind of blur and decolor an image. And it's shown that actually doing this simple thing can really improve VLM performance in classifying what is in that image. In terms of the innovation and data curation, there's a pipeline, a novel pipeline, if you will, that combines a LLM generated prompt with control net for a generation of illusion. So they start out with about 1,000 scene descriptions that were generated from various language models. They combine those descriptions with the source images from Stable Diffusion XL Lightning, at least for the animal subset. And then they combine those images that are generated with diffusion plus the prompt, pass that into ControlNet, and generate this illusion animal. In terms of what we're able to systematically encode is psychological understanding of this kind of phenomenon known as uh, peri, peri, per I can't pronounce it right. Pareidolia, which is just this detecting illusions essentially, and we're able to see through this the way they've kind of encoded expertise is that we can encode human perceptual patterns through really careful image generation. And the full data set, we're only working with the subset of illusions here, but they encode this human expertise and for fashion, animals, characters into the various data sets that they have constructed. Different modalities here. We've got the images that are generated via diffusion. So there's text and vision interaction. There's also different perception layers. There's the real concept versus the illusory concept. And we're able to integrate language understanding with visual perception. So there's also a kind of transformation between modalities from text descriptions to a visual illusion. And then also with the human in the loop, we're able to do a cross-modal validation through human perception and machine interpretation. So let's go ahead and get hands-on with these. So just kind of exploring what's in the data set. The first one I'll look at is ImageNet D. This is all loaded into the open source library FiftyOne. And if you follow along with my GitHub, you'll see exactly what we need to do here. But anytime I come across a data set, the first thing I want to do is kind of get a visual vibe check. So just kind of scrolling through the data set, seeing what's in there. Of course, we can look at the ground truth labels as well. And just real quick, we can create a dashboard here. What I'm going to do is create a frequency plot just to give us a sense of the distribution of classes. We'll do the ground truth label. We'll sort it by frequency. Create the plot here. Oh, dude, I should probably. Did I accidentally cut my session off? Sorry about this, y'all. Give me 1 second here. All right. Then we should be able to reload this here. Yes, of course, the demo gods are not on my side today. Just give me a second here, folks. My apologies. All right, so opening this back up. All right. Pulling up ImageNet D here. All right, so just looking at the dashboard that I was initially planning on building out, we can add our plots to look at the distribution of frequencies across the ground truth. We can order it by frequency. We can create the plot as well, but you can see that natural long tail being exhibited here with the class labels. And so kind of, exploring it one way like this, it's interesting, but what I find most interesting is when I start looking at embeddings. And so what I did with this particular data set is I've created embeddings using a few different models. Only 2 different models in this case. I use this model called AIM V2, which came out at the end of last year. It was a model by Apple. And I looked at the embeddings of these images, so the kind of encoded, the visual encoding of these images using the class embedding and the, pooling across the entire feature map. And what I do here is I'm trying to pick up on whether there's any patterns in the kind of structure of the data set, right? So we can see if I use the class embedding, it looks more or less kind of uniform. If I use mean pooling, there looks to be some structure. And of course, it's always interesting to see what the structure is. And so, this helps me understand, okay, well, this group of images here, these kind of all look like they're waterfront types of images or next to a pool of some sort. In a similar way, we can we can color by the ground truth labels to get more of an understanding. So notice that we have 113 classes, so it's not the best to visualize because we have 113 bubbles pop up here. But we can also look at the embeddings from clip, and you can see some, the embedding space is obviously different in clip, and we see some of that difficulty here. Now, in this original paper, they actually had claimed that clip was the best performing model of all the VLMs that they tested. And they didn't test AIM v2 because I don't think it was released at the time of publication. But I ran both clip and AIM v2 just to see, which one would perform better. So you can see overlaid on each individual image, we have the ground truth in this kind of turquoise color, dark blue, the AIM prediction, and in light blue, the clip prediction. So we can also just quickly evaluate the performance of those models here. And we evaluate them individually and then comparatively as well. So we can see here that AIM v2 has an accuracy of 0.419, and comparing that with clip, we see that clip actually does far worse than AIM v2. In fact, it absolutely blows clip. AIM v2 blows clip out of the water. It just is so much better. But what I found most interesting was actually looking at the confusion matrices to see kind of systematically where it is that these models tend to misclassify stuff. And what this revealed to me was actually maybe there's actually some kind of mislabeling going on in their pipeline. For example, if I scroll here, if I click into zooming in a little bit, clicking into, for example, benches versus chairs. So we can click in here, and so remember the ground truth is in that turquoise color. But as I was looking through here, I noticed that there's some interesting kind of misclassifications, particularly as it comes to like these images being in a park, for example. So this is not the full. I want to actually look at the clip one as well. So we'll look at the clip evaluation. And again, looking at the ground truth here for chairs and benches to get a better idea of where it underperforms. Yeah, as I was kind of looking through here, I noticed that if there was something in a park and the ground truth had labeled that place to sit.
It's 12:30.
As a chair, but it was in the park, the models would classify it as a bench. Trying to find the specific examples here, but the pressure has me a bit at a loss, but we can always filter down here and look at the ground truth label for benches. And there's a couple of really interesting examples that I wanted to show. Let's make this a little bit smaller. Yeah, so for example, like something like this, when it's out in the natural world, models tend to misclassify it. Yeah, so another couple bits of interesting measures that I was able to compute was actually the hardness of a sample. And so with FiftyOne Brain, also open source, you can compute a value called hardness. And so this is interesting because remember that the way this data set was constructed was they already did hard sample mining. So when we go here and we look at like the hard samples, we can see really the hardest of the hard samples. And so what this value of hardness represents is just the uncertainty or difficulty that a model experiences when it's trying to classify a particular sample. So in the brain under the hood, what it's doing is that we're using entropy of the logits, and then a higher entropy means that the model's probability distribution was spread across multiple classes. And so it's really uncertain about these particular predictions. Whereas a lower entropy means that the model is more confident in its predictions. So with computing hardness, what we're doing, we're taking samples with classification labels and the logits, calculate the entropy of those logits to determine hardness, and then we store this hardness value for each sample. So this helps us potentially find annotation errors in our training data set. Helps us discover edge cases that might need some kind of special attention and really understand where it is that our model tends to struggle. And so a good use case for this is to prioritize samples for human review. So we can filter here just with these computed hardness values, the hardest of the hard samples, and get an idea of where it is the models really tend to struggle. And so if we also look at the embeddings here, the clip embeddings, for example, I can color by, these are AIM embeddings. I'll color by AIM hardness. And let's actually look at the mean pooled embeddings. We can see that the images that we're looking at right here, they're highlighted in the embeddings panel. And you can see, you get a sense of what it is that the models are tending to really struggle on, the types of scenarios. But yeah, so this was ImageNet-D. Really fun to explore this data set. Next data set I want to talk to you guys about is the WebUOT data set. So I didn't load all of the frames for WebUOT just because the data set was so massive. In this case, I just looked at only the shorter videos, and the data set itself had a lot of rich metadata associated with it. Every one of these clips, every one of these videos had an attributes.txt file. However, there wasn't any kind of way for me to programmatically map what those attributes meant. They're essentially just in a line, like the attributes.txt was just a number for each line, and there's 23 attributes. So I think it would have been beneficial had the author included some type of way to concretely map what these attributes were. So I kind of had to guess and reverse engineer a lot of these attributes. And if we're kind of considering, if you consider the way that I parse those attributes as correct, it shows actually some interesting misclassifications. Let's specifically look at kind of the underwater scenario and watercolor variations. I mean, looking at, for example, this is clearly a pool of some sort, but the authors here classify this as a river. Assuming that I had parsed this attribute the way that the author had intended. And it's kind of reveals this type of stuff. So we have submarines here, but submarines don't really go into lakes, right? Shouldn't this be an ocean? So that was one struggle that I encountered when trying to parse this data set. But that being said, we can look at some other interesting stuff. So we have a plugins ecosystem with our open source library. So I built a plugin that uses the Hiera model from Meta. So now the Hiera model itself was trained on, I believe, the kinetics data set. So there is a bit of domain gap, but I still think it's useful, and it can still reveal some properties or some structure in the data set that we can find useful. So just looking at the Hiera embeddings, we can see that we have some kind of structure in the data set, and it's mostly as we highlighted, it's mostly in terms of the visual scene that we have here, right? So we can see here that, you know, these more or less look like the same kind of place, right? But this one is marked as river, whereas, you know, this one is marked as sea. So we're able to uncover some annotation mistakes from that perspective. Um, Another thing, if you recall, I mentioned that each one of these frames had a natural language description that accompanied it. So what I did was I also computed the embeddings for that natural language description, and used that to kind of see if there's any structure in the way these captions were generated. And, you know, we see some kind of structure. For example, we can zoom in on these. And on this, we can see, if we just make this a little bit bigger, we can see the captions here. You know, the gray colored fish swimming in the bottom of the sea, the gray, was it seal or something, above soil in the water. So we can see that we're able to pick up the structure in the prompt where we're talking about gray type of aquatic animals here. What I also did was I ran the SAM2 model against the data set as well, just to see how well SAM did at tracking objects underwater. And surprisingly, I mean, SAM did really, really well on this. They didn't explore SAM in the paper at all. So just to show you real quick, this is the ground truth detection, and these are the SAM detections. You can see Sam does a really, really good job at tracking that fish, or whatever, roseline shark throughout the video sequence. So it does really good at tracking. And, you know, I feel like the bounding boxes that we get from Sam are a bit tighter than the ground truth ones. Of course, we can also do a model evaluation. In this case, I've already ran the evaluation in the back end. And we can look at how well SAM performed. So we can see the accuracy, precision recall. I didn't compute mean average precision in this use case, but we see SAM does pretty well in terms of accuracy for underwater tracking. So the next data set I want to talk to you about now is the bioscan data set. So recall the bioscan data set was the data set of insects. So a bit of a trigger warning here if you're creeped out by insects. We're going to be seeing a bunch of them here. So what's interesting about this, as I mentioned, there's multimodal information. So not only do we have the images and kind of the labels in terms of classification, but we also have DNA, binary DNA sequencing, DNA barcode, and location information. And so what I've done here is actually we're able to look at this in the map. It looks like I initialized FiftyOne incorrectly. I thought I did it correct, but we can actually open up a map panel using our map plugin and look geographically where it is that these insects come from. But more interestingly, of course, is looking at the embeddings. Of course, we could build a dashboard the same way that we did before and build a plot for the categories if we'd like. So I've shown you how to do that. But we can also look at the embeddings. And there's a couple of different embeddings I computed. I'm just going to get rid of all these labels. So I computed embeddings using BioClip on the image. And you can see that we see some really nice, clear structure from the BioClip model. So BioClip is part of the OpenClip framework, and we have a native integration with OpenClip, so you can easily run that model against the data set. But we see some interesting and very clear separation just based on the BioClip model. So if we, highlight this, we're able to see exactly what's in that cluster. I also used a model called Barcode BERT to create embeddings of that barcode sequence, the DNA sequence, DNA barcode sequence for each one of these specimens. And of course, we see some clustering here as well. So we get another kind of deeper layer of understanding for this data set. A couple other values I computed here was representativeness and uniqueness. So with the 51 brain, we can compute a representative score, which just tells us how typical or kind of exemplary a sample is of its nearby data points. Probably better to open it alongside of some embeddings. And so we can tune up the representativeness here and see kind of like the most representative images. And so what this tells us is which samples best capture the essence of clusters in our data set. And samples with a high value of representativeness, these serve as a good representation of the entire data set or of the subgroups that these images fall into. And so the way it works is that we generate an embedding of the image, that we use clustering to find natural groupings in that embedding space, and then score each one of these samples based on the proximity to the cluster center. So we can use a couple different methods. We could do cluster center, which just makes a representativeness kind of proportional to the proximity to the cluster center. Or we could use a cluster center downweight, which just means more diversity in the representative samples. And so this is good for really summarizing what's in your data set and visualizing what's in your data set. You can select diverse subsets for downstream annotation. It can also help you create a more balanced training set. And you're also able to find more kind of prototypical examples of the images in each one of these categories. Another value I computed here was uniqueness. So we'll just look at barcode BERT. So uniqueness just tells us how kind of distinct or anomalous a sample is compared to the rest of the data set. So it tells us which samples stand out as unusual or rare. And unique samples tend to occupy a sparse region in the embedding space. And so the way we calculate the value of uniqueness is we take the embeddings of an image, we find the k nearest neighbors for each sample, default is 3, and then we calculate a weighted average of distances to the nearest neighbors. And then we normalize that score in a range of 0 to 1. And so samples with a large distance to the nearest neighbors tend to be in a sparse region of the embedding space. And so these isolated samples, for example, if we highlight these, these kind of isolated samples are considered unique. So remember, this is a high dimensional embedding space. I'm projecting it to 2 dimensions. So if we add a third dimension of the embedding space, we probably see that these points are farther out and along that third axis. But essentially, we're just finding the really isolated samples. Higher scores mean greater uniqueness. This is especially useful when you want to find edge cases or outliers in your data set, when you want to detect potential anomalies or potential errors in your data set. It's good for finding rare but important examples, and helps you really ensure that there's diversity when you're selecting a subset of your data set. And so yeah, really oh, I could actually open a map here. I didn't notice that before. So just looking at this in terms of the different modalities. So you see here we have location information. Again, apologies for the coughing. So we can, each sample has a geolocation information encoded with it, so we can kind of triangulate like that, hit enter and find those samples that are in that geographic region. So for example, I am in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So I'm here in Manitoba, and I can find images, the uh, samples that come from this region, Manitoba. So this gives us another dimension of understanding and exploring our data set. All right, and this brings us, I believe, to the last data set that we're going to talk about, which is the uh, illusion animals data set. So first, I just want to talk about the raw data set here. Started off with a group sample. So remember, they start by generating a image using Stable Diffusion XL. And then in order to go from this generated image to this illusory image, they take this image and they have a text prompt. And so they take the generated image plus the text prompt, send it to ControlNet, and get back this illusory animal. And then with the illusory animals, for example, here's this. The illusion they try to create is, zebras. And then what they did is with that illusioned animal, they applied a Gaussian blur and grayscale to create this filtered animal. And the main kind of thing they wanted to test in this data set was how well do vision language models perform when trying to classify the illusion itself, and how well do they tend to perform on this filtered image. And it seems like a toy, cute kind of example, but I mean, this is important for kind of backdoor attacks against vision language models. If we're able to pass in some type of illusion to if we pass in this type of illusory image to a vision language model, there might be some attacks, backdoor attacks hidden in this image. So potential way to mitigate that is to first blur the image and grayscale it before it gets sent to lit vision language model, and then proceed with that. But this is kind of that pipeline they created. So let's just focus in strictly on the illusion animals. And so what I did in this case, of course, we could start with building out the dashboard. With the dashboard, we can create our plot, categorical histogram, frequencies. We can do a frequency of the ground truth label, and then just sort it by frequency to get a sense of the distribution. So we have more images that are not illusions, and then kind of equal distribution of images that contain an illusion. And so it's always interesting for me is to look at embedding spaces. I'll clear out all of these. And so I create embeddings using AIM-v2, clip, and siglip, and then also create embeddings of the text prompt using Gina clip. I believe it's Gina clip. So here, what I'm trying to see is, okay, does the vision language model, because each one of these models, like not only am I using that as a feature extractor, I'm going to use that as a zero-shot classification model as well. What I'm initially trying to figure out is how well this particular model does at finding the structure in the data set. Because if I see clear clustering in the embedding space, it might be a hint that this model might perform well when it comes to zero-shot classification. So looking at AIM, looking at clip, looking at siglip, we can get a sense of the structure of that embedding space. And just kind of qualitatively looking at this, more or less, they all seem kind of uniform. Like AIM shows some structure, clip shows a little bit of structure. Siglip looks more or less uniform, but we can kind of click into that and see what it's picking up on. So it's kind of picking up on global context of the image. And all the vision language models actually tend to do that. They're tending to pick up on global context of the image. If we look at this kind of island of embeddings, we're able to see that it's not necessarily picking up on the class itself, but picking up on the vibe of the image, if you will. And so after that, what I did was well, let's actually, before I move on to that, let's look at the embeddings for the text as well. So again, this is just embedding the prompt for each one of these. Illusion, so this is a prompt that went into control net, so we can see the distribution of prompts in the embedding space. So, these are all the rustic and lush type of images. These are kind of, if I can look at it, mystical, lava-ish type of images. So, it just gives you a sense of the types of prompts that are used. That would be hard to pick up on if you're just kind of manually eyeballing those prompts. But what I did was next after this was model evaluation. So I ran AIM, CLIP, and then a couple of vision language models against this data set, as well as SIGLIP. In the paper, they said CLIP performed the best. And so I used AIM against the model and then also CLIP. And you can see here that, CLIP is blowing AIM out of the water. It's kind of reigning supreme here. And we can go back here and compare. Let's actually use CLIP as a basis of comparison. Compared to AIM, compared to SIGLIP. So SIGLIP 2 was the latest model that came out from Google. And the checkpoint I used was the CLIP VIT base 32 patch 224. So I was trying to go on par with what the CLIP model they used was in the paper. Just kind of be more apples to apples. And I honestly was expecting more from SIGLIP. If I could be, frank, SIGLIP is in my test has been quite underwhelming. It's not performing as well as I would have hoped it to perform or expected it to perform given all the hype it's received recently. We can see that it doesn't perform very well at all. Basically, less than chance. I also used Janus Pro, which was a vision language model that came out towards the end of January that was well hyped. And frankly, in my test of Janus Pro, it's good, still underwhelming. Not the best vision language model I've explored. But Moondream 2 tends to consistently impress me. It's a really, really good model. You can see here it's the model that ends up being closest in performance to CLIP. So there's Moondream 2 and AIM, but by a long shot, the Moondream 2 vision language model does the best performance. So yeah, that's a really, really powerful, strong, small vision language model. And it's definitely been one of my favorites over this last few months. So yeah, just kind of looking through all of these. So this is just the illusion portion. We can also look at the performance. Excuse me, on the filtered as well. So looking at the embeddings generated for the filtered, blurred and filtered images, clear out those labels. We can see AIM has a lot more structure when it comes to, in the embedding space, when it comes to this blurred version of the illusion. CLIP as well shows a lot of structure, and SIGLIP is just more or less uniform. So again, just really underwhelming performance. And just looking at AIM v2 real quick, we can see that these are now more or less, the clusters that we get are more or less based on the actual class of the image. So a lot stronger, it's picking up a lot stronger on the visual kind of class representation as opposed to using the illusion. See, there's a lot more clear separability here. In terms of model performance, I'm going to pull this up here. We'll use CLIP as the basis of comparison. and Clip performs exceedingly well. And this aligns with what they shown in the paper. Clip performs well. Comparing this against AIM v2, Clip ends up outperforming it. Janus does, half as good as Chance, like just really not well at all. Moondream, you can see here, gets an accuracy of 90%, which is quite impressive. And this accuracy was higher than anything that they had picked up in the paper as well. Comparing this to Siglip, which just twice as good as Chance, if you will. So yeah, Moondream performing really, really well on this. So yeah, that's it for me. I mean, I can go for hours looking into these data sets and exploring them with you. I know we're grossly over time, but thank you guys for hanging out.